Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you again for stopping by. I do appreciate it. I hope you had a great weekend. I took this photograph of the sunrise in the morning at 6:45 a.m. and tweeted "Good morning world." I'll put that photograph up. I rather liked it. And then on Saturday afternoon at midday, I went to Summit's office, which is the floor above me, and I took this photograph of Nairobi as I waited for him. It's rather lovely. Macro thoughts go back to the dollar. The point I'm making is that the dollar has just started getting going. There will be blood in the water. There is a small window if you want to be the sharks. I said that in September 2014. Nouriel Rubini, interesting video via Bloomberg. Crisis is not over in the global economy, he says. I think he's right. Home thoughts, I like this twit pic in translation because I think it was in Russian. It's between heaven and earth. And look at the photograph. It's rather wonderful. I like this tweet from the real Banksy. If there are no ups and downs, you're not alive, he says. I think he's right as well. And then Paula Kahumbu took a photograph of an elephant yesterday evening and tweeted, "That feeling that a stinky, musked bull is perhaps too close." And interestingly, we had the same feeling in the Gari forest, and she wasn't far from there when she took that photograph. And finally, home thoughts, I like this. The sun rises as temperatures register. -15 in Surui, Hokkaido Island, Japan. The island hosts a variety of rare animals. Political reflections. Obviously, Greece is front and center. A comment from the Syriza party: "Our common future in Europe is not the future of austerity." So that sets up a collision immediately between Greece and the EU. We'll watch developments. The euro tumbled in the middle of the night and then has rebounded now to around 112.40. I think it's a short covering and we should fall back down again. I like this a photograph which was tweeted by IBN Live. Barack Obama is given the Guard of Honor by Wing Commander Pooja Thakur, the first lady ever to do so. And this as well, wonderful, Modi ji, who of course was a chaiwala when he was a young boy, repolished his chaiwala image to serve Obama tea. Haaretz tweeted, "The Saudi king is dead, long live the kingdom." I came across this nugget of information on the New Yorker. The link is on the website. This is talking about the dead king. His palaces in Riyadh and Jeddah had shark-filled aquariums the size of rooms. In 2007, I covered a trip by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Defense Secretary Robert Gates to Jeddah, where they were amazed by the sight of sharks swimming behind a glass wall in a dining room. It looked like a scene from Dr. No, an American diplomat told me. "Come in, Mr. Bond. We are going to eat you." That net, I'll put up that photograph I took of the shark in the Dubai Mall aquarium. Another snippet from another article in Bloomberg View. You can read that in full if you go to Rich Wrap-Ups. The Middle East is changing much faster than the House of Saud. Global research calls Saudi Arabia linchpin of regional counter-revolution and US oil interests for the past 2 decades. Robert Fisk in The Independent says King Abdullah's friends in the West stayed loyal. They even put the flag at half-mast in many places. But revolution is on the horizon in Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah died at 90. He had outlived 2 other crown princes. His successor Salman is already 79 and cannot expect to survive much more than a decade. And at 69, the new Crown Prince Mukrim is no spring chicken. Can these old folk go on ruling one of the richest nations on earth without a revolution? Abdullah was rightly fearful of the Arab revolutions in 2011, sending his troops to crush Shia dissent in Bahrain, while promising to throw almost £300 billion in education grants, new infrastructure, public housing, unemployment benefits at his own people to buy their quiescence. But age is withering the monarchy. The last direct family of the kingdom's founder are now growing older. Crown Prince Mukrin is himself the youngest surviving son of King Abdulaziz. And the revolution, and this is an interesting point, that threatens the monarchy will not come from Iran, of whom they've got a pathological fear, nor from Saudi Arabia's own Shia minority, nor the country's armed Wahhabists who are breathing on the border. It will come from within the royal family, which I think is an interesting thought. Put up a photograph of the mourners gathering at King Abdullah's funeral, and then I'll put up a photograph that Twitter handle called @Iran tweeted John Kerry and the Iran Foreign Minister Javad Zarif confer on nuke talks, and a lot of informed talk informing me that this deal is a done deal, that it got unwound last time by Ambassador Susan Rice. Kerry was very upset. If you look at the body language between Kerry and Zarif, you think there's something afoot. Haaretz, Japan calls ISIS video claiming execution of hostage outrageous and impermissible. This caught my attention, I'm sure will catch yours. Angela Merkel and Matteo Renzi holding a press conference in front of Michelangelo's statue of David at the Florence Academy of Fine Arts. And you can look at Renzi's face, it's remarkable, insouciance. And finally, political reflections, Hong Kong's biggest collection of Chinese propaganda posters. And I like this one, which I'll put up. International markets, I returned to a piece I wrote in September 2012 when I called Mario Draghi Super Mario, the Euro's saviour. And then he said, we designed a parkour, a road, and it's in the hands of the governments. And this time I think he's delivered something meaningful. I think he might have to add to it, because I think Europe is sitting on top of a death spiral in a way. And that's what the bond markets are telling us. But essentially they've got a very effective central banker in Mario Draghi, in my view. And that play on the word parkour is the habit of jumping and doing tremendous feats between buildings and so forth. And as I was thinking of Mario Draghi and his parkour, I saw this Middle East Eye Palestinian youth practice parkour in Gaza. Currency markets, the euro, when I walked in this morning, was at 111.76. Right now it's at 112.31. Touched 110.98 in the middle of the night, which was the weakest level since September 2003, before a massive bout of buying, short covering probably, brought it back. Dollar index 94.99, my target of 100. Doesn't look so far away, does it now? Japanese yen 117.57. Japanese exports rose to the highest level in 6 years. That's good news. Swiss franc 0.8790, pound 149.98 when I walked in, at currently 150.05. Aussie 0.7882, touched 0.7855, which is the lowest since July 2009. India rupee 61.425. South Korean won 1080.42, rose 0.4% against the dollar, and the best performer among 16 major currencies tracked by Bloomberg versus the dollar. Rial 258.02, Egyptian pound 740.06. The rand is 1141.61. The euro has tumbled 6.2% during the past month and is the worst performer, naturally, of 10 developed nation currencies tracked by Bloomberg. The yen has risen, interestingly, 5.9%. And yen and gold are quite interesting, aren't they? Both are safe haven assets. Dollar has gained 3.4%. The Canadian currency has tumbled 3.5%. To 74.50 US cents, touched 74.32, the least since November 2011. I think it's still got a lot lower to go. Bloomberg's gauge of the dollar climbed a sixth day, the longest streak since September, on prospects the US economy will outperform those of Europe and Japan as the Fed moves to become the first major central bank to raise interest rates later this year. It sets policy Jan 28. The chance of a Fed interest rate increase by its October meeting was at 51%. I think they might go by mid-year. Dollar index 94.99. I'll put up a 3-month chart. I think it's going way over 100. Anshu Jain gave an interesting interview to Bloomberg, saying his biggest worry in 2015, a disruptive credit event following a Fed turn would be at the top of my worry list sometime in the next 6, max 12 months. We're going to get that Fed turn. That's going to be very significant, he says. And this takes me back to something I said earlier when I said the US economy is the comeback kid of 2015. I said the Federal Reserve has stopped printing dollars, and I think the Fed is just one headline economic print from raising interest rates. A rate hike, even as small as a quarter point, will be the catalyst for a renewed surge in the dollar. And I said then the dollar index is headed a lot higher, but I've been saying that for months. By the dollar, I think the euro-dollar exchange rate is headed to parity, and I see JP Morgan, who I look at for a lot of their chart-based analysis, is saying the same thing. The euro dropped 3.1% to 112.04 on Friday, biggest weekly loss in September 2011, touched 111.15, and then of course overnight it plumbed new lows. I'll put up a graphic image from Hunsader showing the euro having its second worst day since at least 2008. Commodity markets, gold when I came in was at $12.95. It's around the $12.90 level. I think it's very toppy. Crude oil $44, $45.04 around there, looking a little bit soft, quite a bit of selling pressure since Friday afternoon. Lowest settlement on Friday, $45.59 since March 11, 2009. Interesting piece I came across on RT Business, record high Chinese imports of Russian oil in 2014, and the price paid looks quite high. And then there's some very interesting data in this article. Last year, the share of Saudi oil in the Chinese market fell 8%, and the volume from Venezuela dropped 11%, while the share of Russian oil leapt 36%. So quite interesting that I think people would not have expected to have seen such robust imports. VTB gave a very clear warning against any attempts to exclude Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system. And I was telling somebody, President Obama is really very sophisticated in his currency and oil warfare, cutting them off SWIFT, which is something they did to Iran, really cuts you off, cuts the lifeline off, cuts the legs from underneath you. Coming to sub-Saharan Africa, NATO powers must focus their operations of zones of greatest vulnerability, including the Horn of Africa, segments of the Swahili Coast, the area around Lake Chad, and certain parts of the Greater and South Central Asian region. This is John Kerry. Spain is negotiating with the US to give the US a permanent US Marines Africa Force base in Spain. This force's duties to protecting embassies, rescuing military personnel, evacuating civilians. The contingent aims to strengthen vigilance in an area that is a top security priority for our partners and neighbours, but also for Spain. The US has a decisive military advantage, hard power advantage on the African continent, but interestingly, and I call it a game changer, and someone had an issue with me calling it that, but the Chinese insertion of a battalion of soldiers into South Sudan is, in my view, an important new development. Zambia's Lungu won the presidential vote as the opposition objected. I'll put up a photograph of him. Sworn in as president at a tricky time in Africa's second biggest copper producer. That's because copper prices are very low. Lots of noise with the mining sector, quite a lot of challenges. Erdogan popped up in Somalia. I'll put up a photograph of him that Hamza Africa tweeted. Interesting piece by Jason Stearns about protests in Kinshasa, why this time it's different, well worth a read. Past 3 days we've seen the worst protests in Kinshasa since the controversial elections 3 years ago. The violence was sparked by a proposed electoral law that links the electoral process to the census. which could delay national elections by several years and illegally prolong President Kabila's stay in power. He has to step down. In 2016, dozens of protesters have been killed, 42 according to HRW. This is by the police and the Presidential Guard units. Internet, social media, SMS were all closed down, and generally it was, particularly going by social media, not looking very pleasant. Jason is speaking about splits within the elite. This is the big change in the past year, not the street protests, but the divisions among the elites. I didn't know that. Changing protest dynamic. In 2011, the protest centered around UDPS strongholds in Kinshasa. This time, Etienne Tshisekedi, who's been in Brussels for months, waited until Tuesday afternoon to weigh in on the protests more targeted, referencing the rise of social media. There is a reason why the government shut down internet and social media across the country. Smartphone ownership has been exploding in the Congo. And finally, the Congo Senate ruled out census before vote after protests. We've responded to the streets, said the Senate President Leon Kengo Wadondo after the vote. And that is an important point and an important lesson, I think, from Ouagadougou. The street has muscle, has power. We are not forum shopping, he insisted. This is South Sudan. Peace talks where IGAD was previously the convener. Now all of a sudden a new development has happened with President Kikwete. Interesting article, Africa debt rising. An implicit assumption prevails that there is little danger of African countries going bust, while there is no immediate likelihood of widespread sovereign default. The nature and consequences of financial mismanagement in Ghana, a flag bearer for the Africa Rising narrative, should not be ignored. Debt levels do not have to match those of developed economies to trigger an economic crisis. Good point. South African all-share is up 0.18% so far in 2015. Rand was little changed, it firmed up with the news of the European quantitative easing. Yields have fallen tremendously in South Africa. I like this photograph, morning from the skies of Johannesburg. I'm on the chopper reporting on the Soweto attacks. I like the photo this individual took. Dollar Rand 1141.89. Found some support of late, particularly because of the stimulus effect coming out of Europe, I think, and the search for yield. Some of it's going to end up in South Africa. The Egyptian pound 740, softened up a little bit of late. The Egyptian stock market, best performing stock market in Africa again. In 2015, we're up 10.93%, knocking on the door of 10,000. John Kerry breaking with custom to visit Nigeria ahead of vote. The US diplomat will meet the rival presidential candidates to urge that they accept the results of February 14th's poll and instruct their supporters to refrain from violence, asked not to be named under department protocol. Nigeria all-share popped 0.42% higher on Friday. It's still down 14% this year, the worst performing index among 93 global indices tracked by Bloomberg. Naira retreated for a second straight week. I've been talking about this previously. Peter Pham, who was quoted in the Washington Post, says the United States needs to recognize we have a problem that's second only to the problem we have with IS. United States, we have a group holding territory, shooting down jet fighters. If Nigeria collapses, it is the strong state in the region. There are no strong states to contain what would happen if Boko Haram succeeds in carving out an Islamic State in that area. Ghana Stock Exchange minus 3.44% in 2015. Interesting article in The Economist, Foreign Investment in Africa, a Sub-Saharan African Scramble, quoting a friend of mine, Paul Kavuma, who was also a guest at Mindspeak. When Paul Kavuma began approaching private companies in Africa a decade ago to suggest investing in their businesses and improving the way they were run, he was often shown the door. They were offended, asking if I thought they were broke, says the founder of Catalyst Principal Partners. Even when, after hours explaining the merits of private equity, Mr. Kavuma changed business owners' minds, many still struggled with the idea that within a few years he would sell the stake he had bought. When we exited, some people thought we had lost confidence in them rather than we'd finished what we'd come to do. Today, much has changed. African entrepreneurs now boast about being approached by one of the many private equity investors scouring the continent. A few years ago, people would ask, "Why the hell are you in Africa?" says Robert Van Svieten of MPEA, an industry body. Now they ask, "Why the hell aren't you?" Two very good graphs. Have a look at them from The Economist. Here Comes the Money, and private equity investment in Africa by sector, which is also interesting reading because people tend to assume it's all into the commodity sector. It isn't. Coming to Africa, I wrote the following piece over the weekend. Kenyan asset markets have been displaying a lot of alpha, I said. Africa is now more interconnected to the world than ever before. The mobile phone has been a silver bullet in connecting Africans to each other and to the world. The side effect of this increased and even hyper-connectivity in our cities is, I believe, directly responsible for events in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and now in Kinshasa, the DRC. In Kinshasa, the Senate President Leon Kengo Wadondo said after the vote to discard the proposed census that we have responded to the street. What is clear to me is that the street has a voice and has muscle. This is a new development, in my opinion. Returning to the theme of interconnectedness, the world's third sharpest oil price collapse since World War II has created some serious blowback across sub-Saharan Africa. The IMF released its latest World Economic Outlook, in which it downgraded sub-Saharan African GDP for 2015 to 4.9% from 5.8% previously, and 5.2% for 2016 from 6% in a past projection. That's a chunky downsizing. The IMF cut Nigeria's 2015 GDP growth projection to 4.8% from a previous forecast of an expansion of 7.3%. Nigeria, Angola, South Sudan are at the bleeding edge of the global oil price collapse. The Nigerian stock market is the worst performing index worldwide, bar none. The country's central bank has a finger in the dike strategy with the Naira, and there is a tsunami coming. The big story about Nigeria is very much intact, but at this moment, buying Nigeria is like trying to catch a falling knife. Until the oil price stabilizes, and there is absolutely no sign of that, Nigeria, like Russia, Venezuela, Canada, Angola, remains a sell. This is a fact of life and the markets. By the way, Nigerian Eurobonds trade substantially higher than Kenya's. I am not sure we have properly internalized how the new price normal, I predict, will be $50 per barrel or less for the next 24 months, changes the dynamics and timing around Kenya's oil resource. Essentially, at the very least, we have a 48 to 60 month delay in our original best estimates before extraction begins. Buyers of our $2.75 billion of Eurobonds and others were expecting a shorter timeline. We need to reconfigure our plans to factor in that delay. As an importer of petroleum, the sharply reduced price will provide a significant stimulus to our economy. It is very grassroots because everyone buys fuel. This, combined with lower fuel prices, oil is a leader in this regard, will juice the economy meaningfully. The Jubilee government will owe a big vote of thanks to US President Obama, the 21st century oil war specialist, for wrestling the price below $50 a barrel, because these are exactly the right ingredients for recreating the feel-good factor. It was Pradeep Panrana who drew a parallel of the current events with the 2006-2007 period. You will recall that in the fourth quarter of 2007, Kenya grew at its fastest pace since independence. The boom, which came horribly unstuck in 2008, then was built on the back of low fuel and food prices and the one inch having some money in their pocket. If more than 41 million Kenyans have an extra $1 a day in their pockets on average, I venture this will represent a meaningful boost. However, transmission of the low oil price is lagging big time still, but it will catch up. The sharp underperformance in Nigeria is sending portfolio inflows that were aimed at the west of Africa to the east, Nairobi, the south, Johannesburg, which has found some good support in the last few sessions, had a very good run last week. And it is expected, because of the linkages between South Africa and Europe, that some of Dragi's free money is going to come there. The Nairobi All Shares posted a very solid 2.3% return in January. It has been a story of continued big capitalization stocks strength, but previously bombed out shares have staged a comeback. Mumia Sugar up 33.3% this year, Kenya Airways up 13.8% over the same period. In a world of extraordinary moves, from the Swiss franc spinning into orbit to the euro diving off a cliff, Kenyan asset markets have been displaying a lot of alpha, I said. Fitch has affirmed Kenya at B+ outlook stable, but they're expecting government debt to rise to 51.2% of GDP by full year 2016, from 43.3% in full year 2013 and 36.9% in full year 2008. Interesting point they made here. While current debt levels are not unsustainable, Fitch highlights the risk of increased reliance on commercial debt, high carry costs if shovel-ready projects are not available, as well as repayment risk posed by large issue sizes. And on the 17th of November last year, I wrote something. I said, the new challenge is execution. I said, in Scarface's 1983 film, directed by Brian De Palma, Tony Montana says to his boss, Frank Lopez, you short a couple of million, I go on the street for you. I make a couple of moves. $1 million here, $1 million there, you got it. I was saying the availability of cash is evidenced by the more than 4 times oversubscription of the Eurobond and the subsequent tap. But as we leverage Kenya's balance sheet, the new challenge is execution. I think Fitch is touching on that. Capital gains taxes slow activities in oil and gas exploration. This is Deloitte, I've already said that. Kenya shilling at 92.123. Nairobi All Share up 2.33% year to date and within 0.5133% of a record. NSE 20 bounced 0.87% on Friday. It's up 2.06% year to date. Safaricom, overdue a bounce now from the lower end of the range, is up 0.7117% year to date. They announced that they're going to open an M-Pesa Academy, which will be built on a 50-acre piece of land in Thika. Project cost is just shy of 3 billion shillings. Kenya Airways share price data, it's up 13.79% year to date. KCB might well set a record as early as today. It's up 4.385% year to date. Equity Group up 10% so far this year. EABL, about which I like because it's got I believe a very low stop at 300. There's a lot of support there just below there. It's up 1.6233% year to date. I think it's going to 400. Mumia Sugar turned around on Friday, as I wrote. It's up 33.33% year to date. Markets here have been resilient, as I said, and I think that's all around what I was outlining about a potential boost coming from this much lower oil price. Once again, thank you for stopping by.